right, let's get started with the martyrs. Martyrs. If you need a cup of coffee, you might be out of luck. You guys drink plenty. No, I think sometimes we do end up almost running out of coffee. If you wanted tea, I made a couple, and there's some hot water. Lots of the tea bags that we have are very good right now as well. Okay, so I feel like we need to review just for a few minutes. We kind of talked about some of the buildings that they started making, some of the early churches and cemeteries and catacombs. We spent a little bit of time with some of the early art and the different kinds of art, the different artistic things. There's a lot to that, and I really like that history of culture. I really enjoy learning more about what these things were and why they had them and those kind of things. So if you like that kind of stuff, looking up early Christian frescoes and early Christian art, you will have plenty to see. So the martyrs. What I did for these was just pick out a handful of them. I would encourage you, if you have others and stories of saints that you're interested in, just to look them up. You can find lots of great things. That New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia, where a lot of the articles at the beginning of the handouts have been, they have articles on practically every saint. That was written, I think, in 1917, so it's about 100 years old now. A little bit more than 100 years. So it doesn't have the modern saints, but if they lived or died before that time, they'll be in there. Sometimes the entries are really short. Sometimes it says they were a martyr. Okay, because there's some of them that we don't know a lot about, but very often, if we know any of their story, it will be in there. So that encyclopedia is actually this massive, I think it's about 20 or 25 volumes, if you've ever seen it in print, and they're each 1,000 pages long, give or take. So it was a massive thing, and now it's out of copyright, and so they can post it online for being able to access freely, like you don't have to pay for it. That's one of the beautiful things when copyright runs out, that it usually ends up being good for things, because they get spread more widely. Cosmas, so these are just a handful of the martyrs, and I just had to pick some from different times. I picked a few because I like them, I picked a few because I like their names, I picked a few because of friends, and there's a lot more than this. So Cosmas and Damian are two of the early martyrs. They die in 287, which would be, I think, between some of the major persecutions. If I remember rightly, the Decian persecution was in like 250, and then I forget when Diocletian started his madness, but I think that was after 300. So they died in something that was likely more local. They lived in the northern part of modern-day Syria, and they were twin brothers. They were involved in the medical field somehow. They're called doctors, but doctors at this time, the Romans are not famous for their medical knowledge. One of the odd things in history, one of the tragic things, is that the Greeks were much better at medicine than the Romans were, and the ancient Egyptians were better at medicine than the Romans were. So you can find examples, for instance, of people building the pyramids. They found them where they found broken bones that were set and actually healed properly. Even in ancient Egypt, in pyramid building, they figured out how to set bones properly. The Romans, the most famous Roman guy, I think is named Galen, and I'm pretty sure it's him. He proposes the idea of the four humors, if you've ever heard of them. What is it? Phlegm and something and blood and black bile and yellow bile or something. I don't know. Anyway, like that theory, so bloodletting and lots of those different things, people having too much blood and too little blood. Medicine at this time was a little bit different than it is now. Some of it was very herbal remedy based, and some of those herbs actually do have some medicinal qualities. I mean, one of the things that's easy to forget or easy to lose sight of is most modern medicines are derivative. They find the chemical or whatever is the active part of a plant, usually, and figure out how to create it in a lab and purify it. And then they mix that chemical, by chemical I mean like organic compound of some kind, with other things that help stabilize it and help your body process it well. So for instance, lots of blood thinning medications come from leeches, because leeches make compounds in their saliva that prevents your blood from clotting. And so now we can analyze some of these compounds, and so if you look at research, they're often doing things like, growing specialized plants and breeding specialized plants and looking at traditional herbal remedies from areas that haven't been as well explored, because that's where a lot of medicinal stuff comes from. We use the same thing in lots of ways. Stevia is becoming a sweetener for lots of people because it's very low calorie or no calorie, and I think it has very little effect on your glycemic index, so it's good for us in that way. And that's a compound from a plant root that's been purified and synthesized. Maybe not synthesized, they might grow that one. But I think it's good to kind of see that even modern medicine, in a way, isn't all that different. We just have better tools to figure out what's actually helpful and what wasn't. What are the compounds that have an effect, for instance, on headaches? What are the ones that don't? Because you can have lots of junk. It's part of the reason why we know caffeine in coffee is one of the active components. But lots of things, I think there's something more than 1,000 different chemical compounds that make up the rose fragrance. Like, some of them are really, really complex and really, really different. So, suffice it to say that medicine was different at this time and involved a lot more knives and blades and blood than we would like. But they were in the medical field, and they were doctors, and they became famous because they frequently did not accept payment for their services. They did it to genuinely help people. And I don't know if they were born Christian or not, or if they became Christian later. But they're eventually arrested and ordered to recant their Christian faith. I think one of the stories is that they didn't charge for their services, and the other pagan doctors or the other medical people got angry and so reported them to the magistrate, because they were like, if these guys don't charge and we do, then everyone hates us and likes them. And so they get reported to the magistrate and they refuse to recant, and they die as martyrs with 3 other brothers. And for some reason or another, this happens in history. They become some of the most celebrated martyrs in ancient Rome. So there's certain stories that they just grabbed onto. Maybe it was because there was a lot of sickness that went around, lots of diseases were prevalent, but these 2 become the patron saint of just about everything in the medical field. Doctors, I wouldn't be surprised if they're patron saints of nurses, and all sorts of other things. They're 2 great early martyrs. And their remains, at least some of their remains, are in that basilica that I described. I showed you the picture of that mosaic with Jesus, the Good Shepherd, in the middle of it. I think that's on one of the earlier pages. Or Yeah, on page 79, that mosaic is in their church in Rome, the church of Saints Cosmas and Damian. I guess, oh yeah, this one is kind of a good shepherd. You can see the sheep on the bottom. They're kind of funny looking sheep. They're very muscular. So Cosmas and Damian die in 287. I'm not sure if we know exactly when they were born. In lots of cases, it's just kind of a guess. Polycarp is another one. Polycarp is a great name. Poor guy. He probably got made fun of in middle school. Maybe people had lots of strange names at that time. So St. Polycarp was the bishop of a church in Syria, Smyrna, it's in Syria. He also is one of the great heroes of the early church, and he's an important link in the chain because Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. Sometimes Protestants will give Catholics a bad time and say, well, the church invented all of these things. And in lots of cases, like we talked about Ignatius of Antioch earlier, he dies in 107, so he's a bit earlier than these. But like Ignatius of Antioch was a disciple of St. Peter. Polycarp is a disciple of St. John, the apostle. And Irenaeus of Lyon, I don't remember if we talked about him already or if he's upcoming. He's probably upcoming. I wrote about him already, that's why I'm wondering. Irenaeus of Lyon, who ends up in France, Lyon, France, is a disciple of St. Polycarp. So I think he's a great witness to this sort of chain of teaching that like the Christians didn't sort of all die off and the apostles died off and then this new generation comes out of nowhere. It's like the first leaders of the new generation were the ones that knew the leaders of the last generation. Like it's handed on from one group to the next. And Polycarp is very important because the early Christians also treasured those that knew the apostles. They were considered sort of the primary witnesses. Like, yeah, you can be a Christian, but if you knew one of the apostles, we're going to listen more closely to what you said. So persecution is increasing in the city of Smyrna. That's where he was from. It's a city in Syria. And he flees to the countryside. I think, this is some of the sort of backwards debates that they have. So early Christianity, he's like, I want to stay and be a martyr. And his people eventually convince him, like, we need you to lead us. You're a good man and a good bishop. It's not your time to die. Like, you shouldn't run into the barracks of the Roman army shouting that you're a Christian. At least not yet. So they convince him to flee the city for a while. And he is in the countryside. Eventually, he is arrested and brought before a magistrate. He's urged to worship the emperor. And we have his response. Now, some of this, so the martyrdom of St. Polycarp gets written, and I think I included a link to it at the beginning. Hopefully you had a chance to read it. The early Christians lionize these guys. They become legendary heroes of the faith, and they tell their stories, which means there's lots of stories that don't get told as much, but they would take the time to write out their stories and how they resisted the Romans and how they served the Lord and how they stood up for the faith and those kind of things. And then that would be very often read in the church in a service or circulated among those that could read. So in English, his response to those who are encouraging him to recant his faith, he says, 86 years, so 86 years I have served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? So Polycarp seems to have grown up in a Christian home, that he didn't convert later in his life. But you can kind of see, like, the Christians became famous for this sort of bold the Romans are like, we're going to torture you if you don't listen to us, and the Christians tend to say, bring it on. Like, Jesus told us about this, and he said this was going to happen, and you do not have the upper hand. Where usually, if someone's threatening to torture you, you recant and change your story pretty quickly. And the Christians don't, by and large. I mean, some do, certainly, but many of them don't. And that sort of amazes the Romans. They're like, what on earth? Because Roman religion, you'd be like, chuck it. You can't believe Zeus is God. Okay, no problem. Zeus isn't God. I can say that, like, or this person or that, this thing or that thing, they're not gods. Like, Roman society, if you remember, religion was a little bit more skin deep and social. So if the Romans tell you you have to change your religion, it's like, okay, not a problem. And the Christians are like, no way in hell. Very, very different. He's sentenced to be burned. He prays continuously the whole time for his persecutors and the church throughout the world. The burning doesn't work. This is one of the other stories that the modern world just has trouble with. But sometimes they try to kill Christians and all sorts of weird things happen. Try to cut off their heads with an axe, and the axe splinters, and the person's fine. They try to burn people, and they become like inflammable. And usually it's like they get kind of freaked out and start thinking that there's some kind of demons or gods, and so they tend to then take a bit more drastic measures. So in this case, they try to burn him, it doesn't work, so they stab him with a dagger, and then he actually does die. The Christians collect his bones after he died to save them as relics, and they write his story as an honor, and they send it off to another church. Like, look at our bishop. Look at how boldly he stood for the faith. And there's a goodness to that. I'm not saying that is like a prideful thing. Like, there's some pride involved in it, but it helps inspire other people. And because their stories were written down, they survived. I mean, think of how many hundreds of millions of people died in the Roman world, and we don't have a clue of who they were, or where they lived, or when they were born. Their graves probably are forgotten. But these men and women that weren't very important in the eyes of the world have been remembered throughout history. Sebastian. Diocletian's persecution must be earlier, because we have his death in 288. And the sources said that he died in the persecution of Diocletian. So maybe Cosmas and Damian are likely in the persecution of Diocletian as well then. I thought it didn't start until after 300, but it might be earlier. Although I think his is special. So Sebastian seems to have been from southern France. He enters the army and becomes captain of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard is the name of the group of soldiers that was the bodyguard of the emperor himself. He works, so somehow he gets involved in prison stuff, in overseeing a jail, and he helps convert many of the people in prison when some Christians were arrested. And here's their story. Sebastian gets accused before Diocletian himself, and he's sentenced to death. He's tied to a post and shot with a bunch of arrows. That's why in almost every depiction you see him, he's got arrows coming out everywhere. In this case, it looks like their aim wasn't very good, which probably isn't very true. He is nursed back to health by a woman named Irene of Rome. And then, just to stick it to the emperor, he publicly rebukes him for being a bad guy and, doing this to him. Later, his relics were found, so he ends up beaten to death. After he accuses the emperor, I think he does it publicly in the Roman Forum, and soldiers or guards or people around come and beat him, and they kill him. Later, his relics were found. He becomes connected later with, he becomes a patron saint of plague victims because his arrow wounds look like plague sores. his story is written down and spreads within 100 years of his death. And this is one of the other things that we just have a different sensibility about, because we would think like someone's story would be written sort of when they die or shortly after they die, and that it would be spread quickly, because lots of us, if we started writing stories of our great-grandparents who likely died, I don't know, in the last 70 or 80 years, give or take, maybe more for some of you, but I would have no clue. I mean, I would just be making it up. I only got to meet one of my great-grandparents. Only one of them was still alive after I was born. And I don't really remember her very much. Like, I don't remember talking to her. By the time that I was around, she was in a nursing home. So I would just be making it up. Did the early Christians do some of this? Yeah, probably. Some of the stories we think now aren't quite as literal, like pen in hand, as they make it sound. They become famous, for instance, for writing letters, sort of like the Apostle Peter to the church in Gaul, and it was written in like 500. Sometimes they did it to give more authority to what they were saying. Not all of it is bad, but some of it is just sort of funny, where it's like, okay, you're not the Apostle Peter. And I don't know, somehow lying and telling the truth got a little mixed up. So not every story is necessarily, we might get to heaven and find out some of these, maybe not the great martyrs, but especially some of the lesser known ones died in ways that are a little bit different than the stories that are told. That's okay. Saints Perpetua and Felicity, these two die earlier in North Africa, in Carthage. So Carthage is close to modern day Tunisia. What's the capital of Tunisia? Tunis. So modern day Tunis in Tunisia. If you look up the coast a little bit, that's where the ruins of ancient Carthage are. Ancient Carthage, in the time before this, like 500 years before this, was the great foe of ancient Rome. Hannibal and the guy that marched elephants, and those people, those are the Carthaginians. They were sailors. They're genetically related to the Philistines and the Phoenicians. They're part of this group that we would call the Sea Peoples. If you remember that group that settles in after 1200 BC or so, when the world kind of changes, end of Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. Carthaginians are related to that. Well, after the Romans fought the Carthaginians in 3 different wars, they destroyed the city and eventually rebuilt it, and it becomes the Roman capital of northern Africa outside of Alexandria. Persecution was particularly intense there. That community gets very connected to Rome itself, and so governor-wise, civil-wise, and so when the Roman emperor says something, the governor of Carthage is always trying to win bonus points by doing it the most and the greatest and the best. So we'll encounter more martyrs in Carthage. So Perpetua and Felicity are from Carthage. Perpetua was a noblewoman, and Felicity was a slave and pregnant at the time of her imprisonment. This is one of the reasons that I picked these two, is because in Christianity, the heroes cut across layers in society. It's not just the rich and the wealthy. If you look up ancient Roman history and ancient Roman documents, and you want to read things like, I think Herodotus wrote something like the Lives of the 12 Caesars. They were often very, very wealthy people. They're the upper echelons of society. Cicero, Suetonius, Virgil, lots of these different names of Roman authors and playwright, like the higher tier of society, they would write things, but much of society remains hidden. In Christianity, you almost have to feel the sort of seismic shift that all of a sudden social class doesn't matter. It's not, like Perpetua and Felicity are remembered together. Almost all of their churches are consecrated in both of their names. And one of them's a noble and one of them's a slave. And that kind of didn't happen. Nobles owned slaves, but they weren't, remembered in the same breath of air very usually. So Christianity is starting to change that dynamic. Roman society was very, very stratified. There was a group of people at the top that was relatively small. To have most of the high positions in civil government and in the army, you had to come from that class of people, or you had to be so darn good at it that no one could deny it to you. So there's a few cases where people get promoted from very low classes in society to become nobles. But that was rare. If you weren't born into it, it didn't exist. And in Christianity, there's sort of like tear that rule book in half and throw it to the wind, because everyone can be a Christian. Everyone can follow Jesus. Everyone can go to heaven. And it doesn't matter if you're a slave or a rich person or the emperor. Like, the door is open for everyone. That's why I picked these two. There were three others. All were catechumens, and something happens where they get accused, and they know they're going to get arrested, so they all get baptized quickly. They start to be tormented and have challenges in prison. I think I glossed over some of the gorier details. There's things that would make modern authors blush that they write about. But eventually, they bribe the guards to move to a better part of the prison. And many people, they bring people in to tempt them away from Christianity, like their friends and people in society. If you would just recant, if you would just renounce faith, they would release you. You wouldn't have these troubles. Why would you be so selfish and just think of yourself? They bring all of these kind of reasons to them. And I think this is a good place to pause and just consider. It's hard to hold on to faith in difficult circumstances. Like, it's a really scary thought today. What would happen if Christianity actually became persecuted? If you basically had to fight the full weight of the government to be a Christian? How many of us would stick to it? I think that it should make us a little bit more nervous than it might seem to. Like, it's easy to say, yes, I would be faithful to Christ. But it's like, what if it meant you couldn't buy a home, that you had to be homeless? What then? What if it meant they started killing your children? Would you hold on? What if it meant losing your job? What if it meant losing your position in society, or your friends, or your property? Persecution is a very difficult time. And I'm saying this because I don't think we should blame those that didn't always hold fast. Lots of us in various ways have made compromises in faith and have sinned. And there's times where we knew what the right thing to do was, and we didn't do it. And it's not easy. I think we have to wrestle with that and take that seriously. It's part of the reason why the stories of the martyrs get told, is they want to inspire people to hold fast to the faith. They want to talk about the glories of heaven. But it is hard. And as persecution increases, especially as it becomes empire-wide under Decius and later under Diocletian, it becomes increasingly more difficult, and more people turn away from faith. And that ends up provoking a conflict in the church that we'll talk about later, the Donatist controversy and the Lapsi and St. Cyprian of Carthage and those. Oh, look, Cyprian is next. One thing that I would urge you to remember is that this is often faced by Muslim people now. If they convert in most Muslim countries in the world, someone can kill them on the street and it's not a crime. That is not considered murder. It's not even prosecuted. It's considered honorable and noble, because once you're in Islam, you can't leave. There are stories of people who have faced extreme persecution in Muslim areas. In fact, now, there are more martyrs. There have been more martyrs in the last 50 years than there were in the entire centuries of Roman persecution that have been killed by modern governments, atheist governments, the communists, Chinese, in Muslim areas, in radical Hindu areas. There's places and times where converting to Christianity means that parents never talk to their children again, where they celebrate funerals and they treat their kids like they're dead. There was a man some years ago now named Nabil Qureshi, and his story is really, really crazy. I think when he converted, I don't think he ever got to talk to his father again. Eventually, after many years, his mother would talk to him once in a while. But conversion meant losing his entire family and his entire relatives. Sometimes conversion means you have to leave and you can never go back to your home again. There's all kinds of things like that. And so there are really, really beautiful stories and really, really powerful stories of people that are willing to sacrifice everything for the love of Christ. And I think that's really important for us because we have to sacrifice very little in that sense to love Christ. And I think that should make us a little bit more wary, a little bit more appreciative of what we have, like the ability to come and do a Bible study. My friend in Iraq, he was leading a Bible study, and he was asked to be part of a Bible study. It's easier if he doesn't come because they're very suspicious of Western people. And so they had this kind of elaborate ruse that they had to go through where he drove to pick people up in his car because that was sort of allowed. And then when they were going to study the Bible, they dropped people off in this 2-mile circle at different places and then had to hide the car somewhere. And then they all came to the same house at different times from different directions. And they met and they, had one little light on in a room that was almost completely dark. And when they were done, they couldn't all leave at the same time. They had to go one at a time off in their different directions. And then someone went and got the car and drove around for an hour and a half to pick people up and then take them back to their homes. So that kind of stuff does still happen. I'm not sure if as many of you would come to Bible study if it took that much work to get here. It's hard enough to convince yourself to come when it's icy or snowy outside. Perpetua has a young child who she brings, her child is brought to her in prison. And think about this as a mother. I think this is one of the other threats that they have. You can go back and be with your child if you renounce your faith. And her child was recently born. But they refuse. They refuse to sacrifice to the emperor. They're condemned to death by wild beasts. They end up wounded by the animals and then killed by swords later.